The mountains above the Angus Glens are the birthplace of a river that flows east, crossing the Highland boundary fault and rich farmland to reach the North Sea.
The river starts about 750 metres above sea level, high on the plateau of the southern Cairngorms. And that body of water behind me is Loch Esk, and the river that flows from it is the infant South Esk. And I'm going to follow it all the way to the sea.
Scotland's rivers have shaped the nation and are among the country's greatest treasures. Since the earliest times, rivers have been used as natural highways. Along their banks, the first towns and cities were built. And as a natural resource, rivers have provided us with an abundance of food and power. In this series, I'll meet a cast of characters who live along the banks of our great waterways. I'll uncover intriguing tales from the past as I travel across Scotland on a grand tour to explore the original waters of life. In this programme, I'm travelling from the mountains to the sea, from the glittering Skellies to Skirdy-Ness. My grand tour begins high in the Grampian Mountains. Following the river South Esk, the route enters Glen Clova, avoids the plague at Brechin and gets stuck in the mud at Montrose. Journey's end is at Skirdy-Ness.
Now this is a very important and almost magical place because it's here that the river begins as it flows from the loch downhill and becomes the river South Esk. It's very small at the moment, but it's going to get bigger and bigger. And it's so exciting to be at the beginning of something new, like a river and a journey.
The river South Esk flows from the high ground here, known as the Mouth, for 79 kilometres before reaching the North Sea. As you might expect, this is a remote and seldom visited area, but my map suggests otherwise. In the past, people knew the landmarks well enough to name them.
Marked on my map, we've got the Crow Craggies over there, and then just to the right, a great rounded lump of the Crag o' Gowl, and between them is the ruin of the Faferny Shiel. Now that was a summer shieling used by folk who brought their cattle up here in the summertime. But just behind me is the fabulously named Glittering Skellies, the Shining Rocks.
Leaving the Skellies, I follow a narrow path through the heather, my feet treading in the footsteps of much earlier travellers across the Mouth.
All across the High Mouth, there are paths and rights of way threading through the glens and over the moors. Now these were shortcuts connecting communities and saved a lot of legwork going around the mountains.
My path makes a steep descent into Glen Clova, where the South Esk is becoming a substantial stream. Rather confusingly, the Esk is just one of several rivers which share the same name.
There's the North Esk, the South Esk, an Esk in the Lothians, another one in Dumfries and Galloway. There are Esks in northern England, and as you move further south, the word Esk becomes Axe, as in Axminster, and then Ex, as in Exeter. Now, the one thing that these words have in common is that they derive from an ancient Celtic word meaning water.
A few kilometres further down Glen Clova, the South Esk is joined by a tributary that flows from the upper reaches of pretty Glendall. Up here, where the rivers drain, is a haven for some rare and iconic alpine plants. In the quarry, I meet botanists Arlene Finger and Martina Borge, who are going to take me to see one of the rarest plants in Scotland.
So where are we going?
We are going up into one of those gullies up there.
I soon discover that this trip is no stroll in the garden, it's extreme botany. Leaving the path, we climb steeply up a grassy gully between cliffs and rocky outcrops.
So we're going into the heart of the mountain here.
We are.
It's like the lost world up here.
I know.
Ah, and we see the river again.
Look at that.
Once on the summit plateau, it's downhill again, very steeply, to reach a precarious rock garden created by Martina and Arlene.
Martina, it's been a bit of a struggle to get here, to say the least.
It has.
But what have we come to see?
So this lettucey-looking plant is actually the alpine blue sow thistle. So this is one of Scotland's very rarest plants, only found in 4 small populations.
So how come it's so rare?
So actually it's related to lettuce, and it's very palatable to anything that wants to eat it, especially grazing by deer. So it can only survive on these tiny little ledges where it's out of the way of the grazing deer. So the populations have become really isolated now.
I have to say, it doesn't look much. Is it not realised its full potential yet?
It has a lot of potential that it's yet to realise. It's quite early in the year for this plant, and quite soon it will start putting up a lovely long flowering spike which has gorgeous star-shaped sky blue flowers on the end.
The survival of Scotland's tiny wild population of alpine sow thistle now depends on the help of botanists like Arlene and Martina. Seeds are germinated and brought on in a greenhouse before being planted out in the wild.
We collected some root material from the native populations, and then we actually crossbred those different populations in the nursery and created new plants which are a bit more genetically diverse, we hope.
So why is genetic diversity such an important issue?
Genetic diversity is the basis for a species to being able to adapt to new environments and to environmental change, such as what we're experiencing at the moment, climate change, or in case there's an outbreak of new pests and diseases. So plants that have a very low diversity are less likely to being able to cope with all these changes.
And how is the sow thistle doing?
So it's actually doing really well. It's lovely to see now. So the main thing is that it's not been grazed yet, which is just a real relief. And it's a healthy plant. It's about 30 centimetres, which is just what we want to see now in June. So.
And so much effort has gone into raising it.
Yes, enormous amount of effort. So it's great to see.
It's very
clinging
precious,
on.
very precious.
Very
indeed.
precious, yeah.
A healthy wildflower population might seem a small thing, but it means a healthy environment for the whole glen and the river that flows through it. Back in Glen Clova, I pick up the course of the river again as I follow the road southeast. Here the river South Esk meanders slowly through fields and meadows, its waters augmented by many burns and streams that join its onward course. One of them, the Rotal Burn, has had a life-enhancing facelift in recent years.
Now, to demonstrate what I mean, take a look at this map. It shows the Rotal Burn, which flows behind me, filling a straight and deep drainage canal just before it meets the river South Esk. Now, today, things have completely changed. The canal is dry, and the burn follows a wonderfully meandering route as it heads further south. Now, things really have changed.
To find out what's been going on here, I join 2 men in the water, Craig and Steve, who are busy with an odd-looking contraption.
Morning, gents. What are you actually doing?
We're electrofishing for juvenile salmon and trout. What we do is we run a very mild electric current through the water, and it stuns the fish temporarily and enables us to net them up and put them into a bucket.
Right, so what's the purpose of that?
It allows us to monitor the juvenile fish populations in the river to see how successful our remeandering project was.
Now, that sounds absolutely fascinating. What's involved in remeandering a burn?
Well, in the 19th century, the burn was straightened for drainage purposes, mainly for agriculture, we think.
So it became a drainage ditch, really, did it?
Yes, so basically a drainage ditch. That was the value that was placed on the burn at the time. However, when the salmon came to spawn to lay their eggs in the autumn time, they would successfully lay their eggs, but then in the winter floods would come, and because the burn was straightened, all the eggs would just get washed away.
Right.
And we wouldn't find any of the fish that we're doing just now.
So the whole season's spawning would be a failure?
It would just be a complete waste of time, yeah, exactly.
So what did you do to correct that?
Well, 9 years ago, in 2012, the burn was given a new course again, closely aligned to how it was originally.
Was that a huge engineering project?
It was a big engineering project, yeah. We had all sorts of consultants involved to tell us the new channel to follow.
So you had to draw a new channel with meanders, bends in it?
Yes, Yeah.
And how are the fish responding? How are they doing now?
It's been really successful. We've been doing these surveys since 2013, and the densities of juvenile fish that we're finding now is absolutely fantastic. So we're not getting these winter washouts of the eggs anymore.
So it's very noticeable.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely.
That must be fantastically encouraging after all that effort.
It's encouraging and rewarding and motivating to do more. Yeah.
It's inspiring to think that these young salmon represent the success of the remeandering scheme and demonstrate how the health of the whole river system can be improved by doing just one thing. Overlooking the river South Esk, just a few miles further south, is Tulloch Hill, prominent because of the huge monument built to the memory of the 11th Earl of Airlie, who was killed during the Boer War in South Africa. Much less conspicuous is another memorial, where views across the rolling lands of Angus were admired and loved by the men the monument is dedicated to.
This massive 30-ton block of granite was carved and dedicated to the memory of Dr. Edward Wilson and Captain Robert Falcon Scott. Now, both men died on their way back from an expedition to the South Pole in 1912.
Wilson, who had accompanied Scott on a previous expedition to Antarctica, was asked by Scott to become the chief scientific officer on board the ship Terra Nova. Scott visited Wilson at a nearby cottage where he lived and worked. Here, they planned the fateful expedition that would take them as far as it's possible to go, all the way to the South Pole and to a frozen death.
Wilson was a man of faith, and his feelings for the frozen continent that would eventually take his life are touchingly spiritual. Now, up there is an extract from his diary, and it reads, "These days are with one for all time. They are never to be forgotten, and they are to be found nowhere else in all the world but at the poles. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, reigns here in these days." Powerful thought.
Downstream from the Scott Wilson monument, the river winds through rich agricultural land. But there's no path, and it's really too shallow for a boat, so it's time to rethink my mode of transport. Something throaty, perhaps. Donning a ludicrously large crash helmet, I join Mike Sinclair as we ride Harley-Davidsons through the quiet Angus countryside to a place of pilgrimage for petrol heads and lovers of these iconic American machines. Unexpectedly, Harley-Davidson has a pedigree that leads all the way from the US of A back to this corner of Scotland. Reaching the village of Aberlemno, we stop at a modest Button Ben, which amazingly was once the home of a family called Davidson.
This is the Davidson cottage. Well, that's what everyone calls it now. It's actually Netherton Cottage, but it's the home of the Davidsons of Harley-Davidson in Scotland.
170 years ago, Sandy and Margaret Davidson lived in the cottage with their 6 children. Sandy was a blacksmith, but times were hard. Then, in 1857, the family emigrated to Milwaukee, USA. The skilled Davidsons soon found work on the railways, making castings for locomotives. In their spare time, they went fishing. A generation later, getting to the fishing grounds was the reason the Davidson boys and their friend Bill Harley created their first motorcycle.
They saw a French guy, Merkel, doing a demonstration in the middle of Milwaukee of a motorised bicycle, and they thought this would be the way to go to the fishing grounds.
It strikes me that lots of other people, equally enterprising, were having the same idea of putting a bicycle engine on a bicycle frame and creating a motorbike. The Frenchman had already done it.
Yeah, that's right.
So how come Harley-Davidson became such a hugely dynamic engineering company?
It was because of endurance racing, mainly. Walter Davidson, he went out and proved the bike, proved that it was reliable. Then you could shout about it in your shop and say, look, this managed this race without breaking down, and it managed to finish an hour before everyone else and everything, and that's really what pushed it. It was the endurance of the bikes.
But it is amazing to think that this wee cottage here is connected so intimately to the lives of the creators of this legendary bike, this legendary motorbike. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it is really, and we're really proud of that. And all the guys, especially the Scottish guys that come on their Harleys, they're really proud of the fact that this is where it started, kind of thing. Yeah.
Reluctantly returning my borrowed Harley, I reflect on how far the Davidsons travelled from their humble origins as I make my way further east to Brechin, where the River South Esk flows through Scotland's smallest city.
Brechin's claim to city status is its ancient cathedral, which occupies a site that's been sacred since at least the 5th century.
By far the oldest part of the cathedral is the extraordinary 25-metre round tower, which is about 1,000 years old. It was built as a bell tower and doubled as a defensive structure and place of refuge in times of trouble.
The round tower may have deterred human attack, but against the plague it offered no defence at all. In the 1400s, the Black Death ravaged the city, and again in the 1700s, bubonic plague took out almost 60% of the entire population. Things were so bad that even services in the cathedral were suspended.
There is little evidence of those dark days of plague, but just upstream from Brechin, on an estate called Kintrocket, is a curious mound. It's not a plague pit burial site, but something more intriguing. It demonstrates how social distancing might have worked when Brechin was affected by plague and other places weren't.
According to some early accounts, this mound was once used as a kind of market or trading place when the plague struck. Because people from Brechin were not allowed to mix with other folk, social distancing was enforced. So in order to trade, all kinds of goods for sale were placed up here alongside an honesty box. Now these were dark days indeed, and ones that chime with our own times.
Shrugging off the plague, I return to the South Esk as it flows from Brechin through fields and meadows. For this section of the river, I've borrowed a kayak to go with the flow for a mile or so.
Sometimes it's only when you're on the river that you really get a true impression of its nature. And this is true, I think, of the River South Esk, which for most of its length is hidden by a line of trees and foliage. But now that I'm on the river itself, I can get a true understanding of what it's like. I feel as if I've been ushered into the inner sanctum, which I have to say is really rather lovely.
It takes about an hour and a half to reach my next destination. Passing a place with the unhealthy sounding name of the Lurgies, the river becomes tidal as I enter the curious, shallow waters and mud of the Montrose Basin. The largest inland saltwater basin in the UK, it covers a massive area of 750 hectares. It's a place that changes character dramatically depending on whether the tide is in or out. In just over 6 hours, it's transformed from an inland sea to a vast expanse of oozing, sucking mud.
This is an exceptional site for Scotland simply because it's so flat. It makes me think of, I don't know, the Netherlands or Flanders perhaps, with Montrose and its spires on the horizon, dwarfed by the great dome of the sky.
The idea of this part of Scotland looking like Holland almost became a reality in the 17th century when plans were drawn up to drain the basin and turn it into agricultural land. To find out how the mudflats might have become a Dutch polder, I'm meeting local historian Forbes Ingalls.
Forbes, I believe that at one time it was known as the Land of Sands.
That's correct. At low tide it's very much just an area of sand, which the locals the local fisher folk would come here and dig for bait to bait their lines. So it was an important part of their livelihood that it remained the way it was.
And yet that came under threat.
It did indeed. In the late 1600s, the local estate owners decided that they would like to reclaim the basin, and they sent for a Dutch engineer called Droner, who came, and of course he saw no problem.
Well, the Dutch are the experts in these things.
Well, absolutely.
So what was his plan then?
His plan was to build a dike more or less up the middle of the basin, and this would have kept the water back, the seawater back, and allowed the north side of it to be reclaimed.
And it would have been drained, all the land on the other side of the dike, and it would have looked like one of the Dutch polders.
Well,
with
possibly,
windmills,
yes.
and tulip fields and clogs.
Yes. Who knows? It might have changed the history of this part of Scotland forever.
The Dutchman Droner actually began work on his mighty dike. When completed, it was going to be over 3 kilometres long, creating 1,000 acres of new agricultural land. From the air, a section of this ambitious project can still be seen at low tide. But it was never finished.
What happened?
What happened was a big storm blew up, quite unexpectedly and out of season. This was put down to supernatural intervention, and an unfortunate woman called Maggie Cowie, she was seen to be a local witch. She was supposed to have put her finger into the dike. Isn't it always the case?
It is. I was going to say, that's a very common trope.
A very common thing, yes, altogether. And she was found guilty of witchcraft, certainly, if not of destroying the dike. And she actually was burnt at the stake.
That's a terrible tragedy. She must have been innocent. There's no such thing as witchcraft, obviously. And I suspect there was a different agenda being worked through here, because not everyone in the town wanted the dike anyway.
She was possibly just a scapegoat. I think there was a lot of feeling in the town against the project.
But yet the dike was never completed.
That's correct.
So why do you think that was?
It may have been that the estate owners felt this was divine intervention, despite the allegations of witchcraft. So they may have felt the omens were against it.
So it wasn't to be?
It wasn't to be.
So the basin was spared, and the town of Montrose looked to the sea and less to the land as a consequence. As a trading port, the town did business with the Baltic and continental Europe. The wide main street and the fine buildings that line it reflect that former trading wealth. Among the statues to the great and the good is one, unusually, to a dog, who looks sadly and longingly out to sea from his place on the harbour front.
He's a massive beast. He's a St. Bernard, and he has a name, Bumsa.
Andrew Orr has written a book about the heroic dog who inspired the statue that is now dedicated to his memory.
Andrew, Bamsa, the dog here, was a well-travelled beast, was he not?
He certainly was. He came from the very far north of Norway, up at the North Cape, where he was a domestic pet. And when war broke out in 1939, he was taken on board a rusty old whaling ship, commandeered for service in the Royal Norwegian Navy, and he was taken on board by the ship's captain as the ship's mascot.
In 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Norway. The ship Bamsa served aboard escaped to Scotland, along with the 12 other vessels of the Royal Norwegian Navy. From Montrose, they continued their fight against the Nazis.
Did Bamsa actually see active service?
He certainly did. When the Stuka divers were diving, the dog wouldn't scuttle away down below. He stayed on deck with the young sailors and gave them courage. And moreover, he moved forward, right up to the forward gun emplacement and stood there, as it were, facing the enemy in the eye.
And barked ferociously, did he?
And showed his teeth.
Bamsa's courage under fire elevated him from ship's mascot to become a mascot for all the Free Norwegian forces fighting during the war. And when he wasn't facing down the enemy, he enjoyed R&R in Montrose.
There are a lot of pubs around any port, and he was well known in all of them particularly the Anchor Bar and the Caledonian, and he enjoyed a pint of beer very much.
The stress and strain of active service eventually took its toll. In 1944, brave Bamsa died of heart failure. Over 800 people turned out for his funeral in the sand dunes close to Montrose Beach. Today, his statue, which looks towards his homeland across the North Sea, commemorates the big dog who did so much to boost morale during the Second World War. Leaving the harbour, I returned to the South Esk once more. This short stretch connects Montrose Basin to the open sea.
Before the first bridge was built here in the 18th century, there used to be a busy wee ferry crossing backwards and forwards over the River Esk, carrying people and goods into the town of Montrose. Now I'm winding the clock back a wee bit and taking to the water to reach my next destination, a wee village very appropriately called Ferry Den, and it lies just ahead of me.
It only takes a couple of minutes to cross over, but it's a journey that recalls earlier times when people were perhaps more aware of the river simply because they had to cross it. Ferry Den grew up in the 1700s when fishermen from the northeast coast settled here to take advantage of the fishing grounds at the mouth of the river. The last stretch of my grand tour down the River South Esk takes me to the lighthouse built on a rocky shore overlooking the mouth of the river, a place that glories in the name of Skirdy-Ness. Before the lighthouse was built, there were many wrecks on this part of the coast when boats tried to reach the harbour mouth in bad weather. The desperate fisherfolk from Ferry Den petitioned for a lighthouse to prevent further loss of life amongst seafarers.
When the light was first lit in 1870, a great cheer went up from a crowd of local people assembled on the beach opposite, making this an ideal place for me to end my grand tour down the River South Esk, all the way from the glittering Skellies to Skirdy-Ness.
On my final grand tour in this series, I'll be travelling through a landscape rich in history as I explore the River Aire.